In the first lecture video this week, I want to talk a little bit about politics in the 1820s. Last week, we talked about the War of 1812. And the War of 1812, although, again, the U.S. did not win the war, it was a draw. It was still, it didn't feel that way to most Americans. And one of the reasons was because of Andrew Jackson's win at the Battle of New Orleans, where Jackson's army had beat not just the British, but British veterans from the Napoleonic Wars. They beat really good troops. And in fact, at the same time, the Federalist Party, the opposition party, that hadn't been in power in the presidency since John Adams was president from 1796 to 1800, or 1797 to 1800, the Federalist Party was done because just at the height of near the end of the war, right, there had been that Hartford Convention where they were at first thinking about seceding, and then like, no, we won't secede, but we want all these constitutional amendments. That comes out, the Federalist Party is completely done for. There is no opposition party. And in fact, starting in around 1816, we have in U.S. history what's called the era of good feelings. This is one of the only times in U.S. history where there wasn't really there wasn't a two-party system at all. Like everyone supported more or less the governing party. That doesn't last, but it is, and it's overstated a little bit as well. But it is a very much a switch in U.S. politics that will change in the 1820s. Several things happen in the 1820s: the Missouri Compromise, the so-called corrupt bargain, and the election of 1824, and the controversial presidency of Andrew Jackson. Slavery was an increasing issue in the country in this time period. And one of the when the Constitution was created and agreed upon, it was wanted to balance the different sections of the country. And at that time, the power was really between New England and the South. And what was thought was that population was going to increase kind of similarly in different places and other things, and it didn't really work out that way. And so what happens kind of by accident is that there end up being equal numbers of free and slave states in the U.S. Recall that in the U.S. Senate, every state gets 2 senators. And so when we combine free and slave states and we look at them together, in the Senate, it was a dead heat. There were the same number of votes from free states as there were from slave states. And what this map shows is in the late 18 teens, there were 22 states in the Union. Of those 22 states, 11 were free and 11 were slave. They were equal amounts in the Senate. The question is, what would happen going forward? What would happen with, for example, new states that were going to be formed from the Michigan Territory? What would happen for new states that would be formed from what was left of Louisiana Territory? What about when Florida became a state? What about when Arkansas became a state? And so, brokered by Henry Clay, who we were introduced to last week, the Missouri Compromise tried to make a compromise around the issue of slavery in America. And the compromise here was the issue of political power. To keep the balance of power in the Senate, Missouri was going to be admitted as a slave state. Now, the Constitution sort of specifies what it takes for a territory to be admitted as a state. Missouri met those requirements. It was ready to become a state, but the free states didn't want Missouri to become a state because it was potentially going to be a slave state. It was going to give power to the South. And so in this compromise, what was agreed upon was that Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, and then Maine, which was a county of Massachusetts, which wanted independence from Massachusetts for decades, if not longer, would be admitted as a free state to balance it. And so everyone was happy with that compromise because the Senate balance would continue. And then with the exception of Missouri, the Missouri Compromise says that for all future states that came out of the Louisiana Territory, it would be banned north of a line of 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. And so that would include modern Kansas, modern Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Iowa, western Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, and Idaho. That unorganized territory. This would be closed to slavery by the Missouri Compromise. South of that line, the only thing there was Arkansas territory. It would be open to slavery by the Missouri Compromise. So the Missouri Compromise is passed in 1820. I think I got those dates mixed up a minute ago. I apologize. In 1820, Maine's admitted as a free state, followed by Missouri as a slave state in 1821. The next election is 1824. The election is between four candidates. William Crawford, who is the Republican or the Democratic Republican candidate. This is the National Party. Andrew Jackson, who is not associated with a major party. He was the candidate basically of the Tennessee state legislature. And then Henry Clay, who we've just seen again, ran as an independent candidate. And so did John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. Remember, John Quincy Adams had been a Federalist, had broken with his party over his support of Jefferson's embargo. And he runs independently. And so here are the results, what became known as the corrupt bargain. If we look at the electoral vote, most electoral votes went to Andrew Jackson. He got 38% of the electoral vote. John Quincy Adams got 32%. William Crawford and Henry Clay trailed. Now recall that the electoral vote is the only vote that counts for the U.S. presidency. The Electoral College chooses the president. But a plurality isn't enough. You need a majority. In other words, 50% plus 1. This is obviously not 50% plus 1. Now, even more so, Andrew Jackson did better in the popular vote than he did in the electoral vote. So this is an era when, as your textbook talks about, democracy is growing. When the U.S. was first founded, famously when the Constitution was created, particularly at the end of the Constitutional Convention, when Franklin walks out of the meeting near the end of it, or maybe at the end of it, someone asked Mr. Franklin, what sort of government do we now have? And Franklin said, "You have a republic if you can keep it." Now, all a republic is a government that doesn't have a king, but it actually meant something a little different in Franklin's day than that very kind of generic political science definition. And a republic wasn't quite the same thing as a democracy. You're familiar with the Electoral College, right? The fact that popular vote does not directly elect the president in the U.S. That was very deliberate. At the time of the Constitution, senators were also not elected by popular vote. That didn't occur for all states until the early 20th century. They were elected. The states could choose. Each state could choose how to elect its senators, and they were typically chosen by the state legislature. So these are both examples of indirect democracy. So, for example, if it were 100 years ago, and not 100 years ago, if it were 200 years ago, and you were living in 1824 somewhere in one of these states, let's say you were living in Illinois, that's the closest state to where I am and probably where you are as well. When you are going to vote, who do you vote for national office? Well, you vote for your member in the House of Representatives, for your representative. You do not vote for senator. Instead, you vote for your representatives in the state legislature. They choose your senator. Similarly for president, you don't vote for president, you vote for a slate of electors, the people who are going to choose. And so you vote for the electors that say they're going to vote for this person, or the ones who say they're going to vote for that person. These are checks on democracy. We often talk about the Constitution having checks and balances. And some of those checks and balances are in fact on direct democracy. That was very intentional. There was also lots of restrictions placed on voting. And by restrictions here, I don't mean restrictions based on gender, which of course existed in most states, or restrictions based on race, which again existed in most states, although not all the time and not in all states for both those things. By and large, in the early Republican period, only property owners could vote. And the idea behind this was that you only had a vested interest in your community if you had set down roots there by owning property. If you were not a property owner and you didn't like election results, you could pick up stakes and move somewhere else. Now, we today recognize that there are all sorts of issues with that, or at least most people do. But that was what was widely believed. It was also believed that only kind of the better sort, quote unquote, should vote, and that usually meant property owners. And the idea here was that these would be people who were better able to understand the issues and to make rational choices of election candidates. And so property ownership as a qualification for voting was very widespread. And in fact, a few states were progressive for the time enough that they didn't care if you were a man or a woman as long as you owned property. If you owned property, you could vote. Similarly, a few states in the North didn't care what your race was. If you owned property and you were a Black American, you could vote. Now, those exceptions for race and gender did not last long, but they were occasionally there during the early period. Over time, and this accelerated throughout U.S. history, um, there was a movement towards democracy. And in fact, if you go on in history, if you become a history major or a history major, and you do in-depth study of the 19th century, lots of books written about the early 19th century all have often have titles about this because it's a common theme in them is the movement towards more democracy in American government. And a big part of this was removing the land ownership requirement for voting. And this was increasing in the 1820s. Andrew Jackson supporters are by and large newly enfranchised voters. His support does not come from the elites. His support does not come from landowners. His support largely, not entirely, but largely comes from new voters who had received the new franchise and who did not own property. So this popular vote largely reflects the increased electorate of this time. But regardless, Jackson doesn't win. He doesn't get a majority. When that happens, the Constitution tells us what will happen. The election goes to the House of Representatives. If no one has a majority in Electoral College, the House of Representatives, which is the House that at that time was chosen directly by the people, will choose the president. And specifically, the top three vote getters go, which would have been Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Crawford, though, had a stroke, and that left Adams and Jackson. Henry Clay was not in the top three, so he did not go on. He was Speaker of the House. Remember that at that time, Speaker of the House was the most powerful political position in the country other than President. And he threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. And Jackson was outraged, and he called Clay the Judas of the West, making an allusion to the New Testament and Judas Iscariot's betrayal of Jesus of Nazareth. And he argued that Clay was opposed Southern and Western interests. These were Jackson's strong points. These were Jackson's areas of greatest support, were in the South and the West. So here is a map of the election results that might sort of show this regional split that's occurring. So the colors on the map represent the candidate. The map itself represents electoral votes, because electoral votes are what count. Notice that several states split their electoral votes. That is today unusual in many states. A few states do it, and a few states, in fact, forbid that even from happening today. But at the time, I believe it's always challenging when someone says, "Oh, this is what the founders intended," because the founders disagree with each other about nearly everything. But I would argue the founders intended Electoral College to be a check on the popular vote. And so if an elector believed that, you know what, the person that the people voted for is not a person who should be president, they would not vote for that person. And so it was more common in the past sometimes for splits to occur. So what we see here is the areas in green are areas of support for Jackson. And notice his support in the South for the most part, and in what was then would be the West. And so that would include places like Illinois and Indiana, as well as support in the mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. Um, John Quincy Adams, who was at one point a Federalist, had strong support in New England, as you see here. And then Crawford, the Democratic Republican or Democratic or Jeffersonian Republican candidate, call him what you will, um, was the third place candidate and did not really have widespread, as we see, electoral support. He won 16% of the vote. He won Virginia. Virginia was hugely populated at the time. So the most votes possible were in New York. New York had the biggest population. It had, let me see if I can count quickly here. It had 36 electoral votes, if I'm counting that right. And then second was Pennsylvania with 28, and third was Virginia with 24. And so these represent what at the time were the three biggest, most populous states in the Union: New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia. And New York is overwhelmingly, but not entirely, Adams. Pennsylvania is Jackson, and Virginia is Crawford. And in fact, Virginia is the height of Crawford's support. Like, it's probably his biggest area of support. And then Clay was popular in the West: Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri. That's also right where Jackson was popular. Right, Clay was from the West. He had born in Virginia, moved west when he started serving in Congress and in the government. And so when Jackson calls Clay a Judas, what he is saying is he's not just opposed to Jackson, he is opposed to the interests of the West and the South, which are Jackson's interest in Jackson's eyes. So the election goes to the House. When the election goes to the House, each representative doesn't get a vote. Each state delegation gets a vote. So, for example, in the House, New York would have received 1 vote. Pennsylvania, 1 vote. Virginia, 1 vote. Missouri, newly admitted a few years before, 1 vote, and so on. And so these are the results from the House. So even though Crawford had a stroke, he still received votes, right? He was still running. He just wasn't a force to be reckoned with anymore. I think everyone knew, for better or for worse, he was not going to be named president. Jackson gets support in some of the areas he had support previously, like his home state of Tennessee, some other southern states, the areas in the mid-Atlantic that he was strong in, as well as Indiana. But other places, including some states that he had won, like Illinois, or almost won, go for Adams. And in fact, Adams gets the House of Representatives elects Adams. Or elects, sorry. Yes, Adams. Elects Adams. It's been a long day. Jackson is so irate, he withdraws from the party. So do his supporters. This is the official end of the era of good feelings. And remember, we look at candidates. There was only really one party that had an official candidate. That was the Republicans or Democratic Republicans in Crawford. Jackson was very much a Democratic Republican, but he was running basically from his home state of Tennessee. The others ran independently. As I mentioned, I already talked about the spread of democracy. As that single party system that was briefly in place after the War of 1812, as that system unraveled, factions start to emerge, and lots of small parties start to emerge. For example, there's an anti-Masonic party, which is opposed to secret organizations like the Freemasons. There are parties that I think your book has talked about in maybe some of the previous chapters that emerge that are, for example, nativist parties that are against immigration, like the so-called Know-Nothings. Lots of factions emerge within parties. John Quincy Adams, the Federalist at heart that he was, disliked such factionalism. But Jackson was very much a politician, and he worked extremely well in a faction driven environment. And the next election, the next presidential election, 1828, Jackson overwhelmingly wins it. And it was an incredibly nasty election. You know, people for the past decade now, at least, maybe the past 20 years even, have talked about how nasty American politics have become and how factionalized it seems that things have become, how partisan things have become. That is typical in U.S. history. Um, that is very typical in U.S. history. Jackson supporters in this election said that John Quincy Adams, was corrupt, he was cold, and he was aristocratic. Supporters of John Quincy Adams said that Jackson was poorly educated. They more or less accused him of being illiterate and that he was completely ill mannered. He had no manners whatsoever. Jackson did not have a conventional education. That doesn't mean that he was illiterate. Um, Rachel Donaldson was the love of Jackson's life. She had been married before, and her husband was not a nice man by all accounts. He left her, and she had heard that he was going to file for divorce. And so she assumed they had been divorced and goes on to marry Andrew Jackson. It turns out that he did not file for divorce after all, and they were still married, which meant, of course, that it was a bigamous marriage, like she was married to someone else, still married to someone else. Um, Initially, it wasn't a big deal. She and the first husband the divorce occurred, and then she and Andrew Jackson remarried. But when Jackson entered sort of the national political scene, everything changed. This sort of scandal, which truly wasn't much of a scandal from his past, shows up, and it gets um, tons of press attention, political attention at the time. Rachel Jackson dies during Jackson's presidency. She had never been in good health. She died of tuberculosis. Jackson essentially blamed his political enemies. He blamed the scandals that had occurred over her first marriage for her death. Um, Comes a little bit unhinged over it, even arguably, and perhaps understandably. Um, the inauguration, by sort of popular accounts, was not the normal sort of typical affair. Jackson threw the White House open to his supporters, and they, according to legend, kind of ran roughshod, going basically yeehawing throughout the building. There was also a controversy over a kitchen cabinet. So the president has to have a cabinet of advisors. The Constitution says that, but it doesn't really specify who that cabinet will be. And so the cabinet includes people like the Attorney General, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, today the Secretary of Defense, and so on. These cabinet level offices are not dictated by the Constitution, and they come and go through history. So, for example, in Jackson's era, there was the Secretary of War who was in charge of the Department of War. There are separate secretaries of the Army who was in charge of the Department of the Army, and of the Navy who was in charge of the Department of the Navy. Over time, those three departments merged to become the Department of Defense, and there's a Secretary of Defense. So the cabinet officials aren't set by the Constitution; they are set by law. They have to be approved by the Senate. That's one of the checks and balances, that the Constitution doesn't want necessarily just anyone advising the president. They want the other branches, one other branch at least, to have some say in it. Um, Jackson relied on what is still called a kitchen cabinet, which means that these are people who don't have a formal role. They have not been approved by the Senate, and they end up serving as informal advisors. That term kitchen cabinet has kind of gone out of fashion. Lots of presidents are advised by lots of people that aren't approved by the Senate. But at this time in the Jackson administration, this was really seen as a sign that the Jackson presidency just was not working in sort of the proper way that people, especially the elites of the time, thought the U.S. presidency should work in. So this takes us up to the start of the Jackson administration, and our next video will take a look at some of the major happenings of his presidency. Thanks for watching.